The ancient whispers of the Black Forest were meant to conceal, to swallow up secrets whole. Yet Eleanor Vance, a woman who once believed her life was an open book of gilded expectations, carried hers deeper into its shadowed embrace, hoping it would be safe there. It was a naive hope, born of desperation and a profound misunderstanding of both the wild and the true nature of her own burden. She was 28 years old, and every one of those years had been spent in the manicured gardens and hushed halls of privilege, far from the raw, untamed reality that now clawed at her designer boots. Eleanor, a woman who had navigated the intricate social labyrinths of Munich's elite with effortless grace, now found herself stumbling through a landscape utterly alien. The scent of pine, damp earth, and decaying leaves, once a romantic notion in a perfumed candle, now clung to her tattered clothes, a constant, earthy reminder of her descent. Her elegant, tailored coat, a masterpiece of Bavarian craftsmanship, hung in shreds, snagged by unseen branches, its expensive fabric no match for the relentless grip of the forest. Her Italian leather boots, designed for cobblestone streets, were caked with a thick, clinging mud that threatened to pull them from her feet with every weary step. She wasn't seeking the thrill of a wilderness adventure. No, her flight was born of a far more profound, a far more terrifying impulse. She was fleeing. The life she had known, a meticulously constructed edifice of financial acumen and societal expectation, had not merely fractured, it had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces, leaving her with no viable choice but to vanish. Her pregnancy, a secret guarded with the ferocity of a cornered animal, was now dangerously advanced. Each step she took was a searing, painful reminder of the fragile new life she carried within her, a tiny, beating heart caught in the impossible, untenable situation that had become her existence. The physical strain was immense, a dull ache in her lower back, a constant pressure, a nausea that never quite subsided. But the mental burden, the relentless echo of her choices and their consequences, was far heavier. She thought of Julian, of the promises they had made, the future they had dared to dream, now scattered like autumn leaves in a gale. His face, once a beacon of hope, was now a torment, a phantom limb of her broken life. She clutched at the rough fabric of her coat, not for warmth, but as if to hold on to the last vestiges of sanity in a world that had turned on her. The forest, with its indifferent silence, offered no solace, only a deeper, more profound sense of isolation. She was utterly alone, save for the silent passenger within her, a life for which she had sacrificed everything. The sun, a pale, watery disk, struggled to pierce the dense canopy, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock her every move, lengthening her path, making the distant promise of safety feel impossibly far. Days blurred into a monotonous, grinding struggle against hunger, cold, and an overwhelming sense of isolation that pressed in on her from all sides. Eleanor, a woman whose most arduous decision once involved selecting between a Tuscan villa and a chalet in the Alps, now found herself relying on the most basic, primal instincts of survival. Her fingers, once accustomed to delicate silverware and crisp banknotes, were now raw and torn from grubbing for wild berries, often bitter and sparse, or attempting to identify edible roots from the damp forest floor. She constructed makeshift lean-tos from fallen branches and broad leaves, crude shelters that offered scant protection against the biting night air and the incessant chilling drizzle. Her meager provisions, a small bag of dried fruit and some hard biscuits, had dwindled to nothing 3 days prior, leaving her stomach a hollow, aching void. Eleanor, a woman whose most arduous decision once involved selecting between a Tuscan villa and a chalet in the Alps, now found herself relying on the most basic, primal instincts of survival. Her fingers, once accustomed to delicate silverware and crisp banknotes, were now raw and torn from grubbing for wild berries, often bitter and sparse, or attempting to identify edible roots from the damp forest floor. She constructed makeshift lean-tos from fallen branches and broad leaves, crude shelters that offered scant protection against the biting night air and the incessant chilling drizzle.
Her meager provisions, a small bag of dried fruit and some hard biscuits, had dwindled to nothing 3 days prior, leaving her stomach a hollow, aching void.
The wilderness, initially perceived as a potential sanctuary, a vast, indifferent space where she could disappear, had quickly transformed into a relentless, unforgiving adversary. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through her, reminding her of the unseen dangers that lurked beyond her limited sight. The fear for her unborn child gnawed at her, a constant, sharp ache that was far more insidious than the physical exhaustion. She would place a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the faint, reassuring flutter of movement, and a wave of fierce, protective love would wash over her, momentarily eclipsing the despair. But then the reality would crash back down. How could she protect this innocent life? How could she bring a child into this brutal, unforgiving world she had fled into? The cold seeped into her bones, the hunger weakened her resolve, and the isolation threatened to unravel the very fabric of her mind. She talked to herself, to the unborn child, sometimes even to the silent trees, just to hear the sound of a human voice. Her voice, hoarse and thin, was barely a whisper against the vastness of the forest. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that she couldn't last much longer. The thought was not one of surrender, but of stark, brutal assessment. Her body, once a vessel of effortless elegance, was now a fragile, breaking shell. The clock was ticking, not just for her, but for the life she carried. It was during a particularly harsh night, the air biting with a frost that promised snow, huddled beneath the sparse, ancient canopy of firs, that she first saw her. The forest was a symphony of creaks and groans, the wind sighing through the branches like a mournful spirit. Yet an unnatural silence had fallen just moments before, prickling the hairs on Eleanor's neck. Then, from the deepening shadows at the edge of a small clearing, she emerged. A large, gray wolf, its coat a tapestry of muted earth tones, its form powerful and lean. Its eyes, glowing with an unsettling, almost human-like intelligence, fixed directly upon her, piercing the gloom. Eleanor's heart, already a frantic drum against her ribs, pounded with a primal, ancient fear that transcended her exhaustion. Every instinct screamed danger, predator, the end. Yet, the wolf made no move to approach. No menacing growl escaped its muzzle. No predatory glint sharpened its gaze. It simply observed, a silent, almost watchful presence that seemed to hold its breath along with her. She dared not move, dared not even blink, convinced that any sudden motion would trigger an attack. The cold seeped deeper, but a different kind of chill, one of profound awe and terror, held her captive. For what felt like an eternity, they remained locked in this silent tableau, the woman and the wild beast, both solitary figures under the indifferent gaze of the moon. As the first pale hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, the wolf melted back into the shadows as silently as it had appeared, leaving Eleanor trembling, unsure if what she had witnessed was real or a hallucination born of delirium. But the next day, and the day after that, the wolf returned. It kept its cautious distance, a silent, watchful presence, always just beyond the reach of her fear, always there, a gray sentinel in the periphery of her waking nightmare. She began to see it not just at night, but sometimes in the late afternoon, a fleeting glimpse between the trees, a shadow that moved with uncanny grace, always observing, never engaging. She even began to wonder, in her delirious state, if the wolf was perhaps just a particularly large, very quiet stray dog that had lost its way from some distant Bavarian farm, an utterly ridiculous thought in the heart of the ancient wild forest. The absurdity of her stray dog theory was a fleeting flicker of humor in the encroaching darkness of her mind, quickly extinguished by the cold, hard reality of the forest. This was no lost pet. This was a creature of pure, untamed wilderness, its very presence a testament to the brutal, beautiful indifference of nature. Eleanor's initial terror, though still a persistent undercurrent, began to subtly morph into a gnawing bewilderment. Why did it not attack? Why did it merely watch? The questions circled endlessly in her exhausted brain, each answerless query chipping away at her remaining sanity. Her body, a canvas of scrapes and bruises, screamed for rest, but her mind, haunted by the wolf's intelligent gaze, found little peace. She started to allocate a small, desperate corner of her dwindling mental energy to observing the observer. She noticed its patterns. It never approached her camp directly, always circling, always appearing and disappearing with an almost supernatural stealth. Sometimes she would wake in the dead of night, a shiver running down her spine, not from cold, but from the distinct feeling of being watched. And sure enough, if she dared to peer through the gaps in her crude shelter, she would catch the faint, reflective gleam of those amber eyes. They held no malice, she slowly, tentatively concluded, but rather a profound, ancient curiosity, an assessment that felt both invasive and strangely impersonal. It was as if she were a specimen under examination, a puzzle the wolf was trying to solve. The constant vigilance, however, exacted a heavy toll. Sleep became a fitful, shallow affair, haunted by dreams of chasing shadows and silent, judging eyes. Her strength, already severely compromised by malnutrition and the relentless physical demands of her flight, waned further. Her vision sometimes blurred at the edges, and her head often swam with a lightheadedness that made every movement a precarious gamble. The Black Forest, with its towering ancient trees and its deep, resonant silence, became both her prison and her only hope. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and the faint musky odor of wild animals, filled her lungs with each shallow breath. She heard the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the mournful cry of a raven, each sound amplifying her isolation. Yet the wolf's presence, however unnerving, was also the only constant, the only living thing that hadn't abandoned her. She found herself, in moments of extreme vulnerability, whispering to it, a low, raspy murmur carried on the wind. "Why are you here?" she'd ask, her voice barely audible. "What do you want?" Of course, there was no answer, only the silent, unwavering gaze, a mirror to her own desperate uncertainty. Her contractions, initially sporadic and easily dismissed as Braxton Hicks, began to intensify. A dull ache would start low in her back, slowly tightening, spreading across her abdomen, a wave of discomfort that stole her breath and left her gasping. Then, just as suddenly, it would recede, leaving her body trembling and slick with cold sweat. These were not the gentle warnings she had read about in prenatal books. These were visceral, undeniable tremors of her body preparing for the ultimate ordeal. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of exhaustion. She was alone, utterly, irrevocably alone. No doctors, no midwives, no comforting hand to hold. Only the vast, indifferent forest and the silent, watchful wolf. As Eleanor's strength waned and her contractions began to assert their undeniable presence, sporadic and terrifying at first, then growing in intensity and frequency, the wolf's behavior shifted. It was no longer merely watching from the shadows. Its movements became more purposeful, its presence more pronounced. It seemed to patrol the perimeter of her makeshift camp with an almost deliberate intent, its low growls occasionally echoing through the trees. These were not the aggressive snarls of a hunter, but rather a deeper, more resonant sound, a warning, she slowly realized, to unseen threats beyond her immediate perception. Perhaps a curious deer, or a foraging wild boar, or even another, more dangerous predator. The growls, initially startling, began to take on a strange, almost comforting rhythm, a primal barrier against the unknown. A strange, inexplicable sense of connection began to form in the crucible of her desperation. In her deepest vulnerability, stripped of all the trappings of her former life, Eleanor found herself looking to the wild creature, not with the paralyzing fear that had gripped her initially, but with a nascent, desperate hope. It was illogical, absurd even, but the wolf was there. It hadn't left, it hadn't attacked, it was simply present. The sheer constancy of its presence, its unwavering vigilance, began to chip away at her ingrained human prejudice against predators. This lone female wolf, she mused in her haze, seemed to sense her impending motherhood, a shared biological imperative that transcended species. There was a primal recognition in its eyes, a silent understanding of the momentous, terrifying event that was about to unfold. She saw a flicker of something she dared not name, perhaps empathy, perhaps simply a deep, instinctual awareness of another female in a vulnerable state. One afternoon, a sharp, sudden crack of a branch nearby startled her, and she cried out, a raw, involuntary sound of fear. Immediately, the wolf, which she hadn't realized was so close, emerged from behind a thicket of ferns, its hackles slightly raised, its head tilted, listening intently towards the source of the sound. It stood there for a long moment, a formidable silhouette against the dappled sunlight, before letting out a series of low, rumbling growls directed away from Eleanor. Whatever had caused the noise, it retreated, and the wolf, after another moment of watchful stillness, settled back down a little further away, but still within her sight. It was a small act, easily dismissed as territorial behavior, but to Eleanor, it felt like a deliberate act of protection. A silent pact was being forged, not in words, but in shared moments of vulnerability and unexpected guardianship. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath as the labor truly began. It came suddenly and violently, a searing, inescapable pain that ripped through her, stealing the air from her lungs. One moment she was huddled, shivering. The next, a tidal wave of agony crashed over her, forcing a guttural scream from her throat. The sound, raw and primal, echoed into the empty, indifferent forest, swallowed by the ancient trees. Her body, pushed to its absolute limits, convulsed, muscles she hadn't known she possessed, clenching and releasing with merciless force. She clawed at the damp earth, her nails tearing at the moss and soil, desperate for an anchor, anything to ground her in the swirling vortex of pain. Tears, hot and involuntary, streamed down her face, mingling with the cold sweat that plastered her hair to her temples. She was alone, utterly and completely, or so she thought in the haze of her suffering. The world narrowed to the relentless rhythm of contractions, a brutal biological clock ticking towards an unknown outcome. Then, through the blinding pain, a flicker of movement. The wolf, hearing her cries, moved closer. Not rushing, not bounding, but with a measured, deliberate pace, its eyes never leaving her. It stopped a short distance away, close enough that she could feel the subtle shift in the air, smell the wild scent of its fur. It didn't approach too closely, maintaining a respectful, almost reverent distance, but its presence was undeniable. It lay down, settling its powerful body onto the forest floor, its head resting on its paws, but its eyes remained fixed on her. Its steady breathing, a soft, rhythmic whoosh, was the only sound that cut through the roaring in Eleanor's ears. Its watchful eyes, no longer merely curious, now seemed to hold a profound, silent understanding, a testament to an unexpected bond forming in the heart of the wild. In that moment, the wolf was not a predator, not a threat, but a stark, primal comfort, a silent witness to the most vulnerable, most powerful act of her life. The hours that followed blurred into an agonizing eternity, a timeless void filled only with pain and the wolf's unwavering presence. Through each wave of contraction, each gasp and cry, the wolf remained. It never stirred, never looked away, its amber eyes a constant, reassuring anchor in Eleanor's swirling torment.
The forest, usually alive with nocturnal sounds, seemed hushed, holding its breath in deference to the raw drama unfolding within its depths. Eleanor, her body pushed beyond any limit she had ever conceived, found herself focusing on the wolf, drawing a strange, inexplicable strength from its silent vigil. Its steady gaze was a silent promise, a non-verbal affirmation that she was not entirely alone. It was in the darkest hour, just before the first hint of pre-dawn gray, that a new threat emerged. A heavy, shuffling sound, a deep, resonant snort, broke the hushed silence. The scent of damp fur and something wild, powerful, filled the air. A bear, drawn by the scent of blood and distress, its massive form a dark, looming shadow, ventured too close to the clearing. Eleanor, barely conscious, felt a new surge of terror, a cold, visceral dread that momentarily eclipsed the pain of labor. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, darted towards the approaching danger.
She was utterly helpless, vulnerable, a mere offering to the raw power of the wilderness. But before the bear could take another step, before Eleanor could even fully register the magnitude of the new threat, the wolf moved. It rose with a fluid, terrifying grace, its hackles bristling, its teeth bared in a fierce, guttural snarl that ripped through the night. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated warning, a primal challenge that resonated with ancient power. The wolf, usually so silent and cautious, now stood as a formidable guardian, a beacon of ferocious protection. It confronted the larger animal, not with reckless abandon, but with a strategic, unwavering defiance. It circled, feinting, its growls deepening into a continuous, menacing rumble, its eyes blazing with an intensity that promised a fight to the death. The bear, surprised by the wolf's unexpected aggression and perhaps sensing the unusual circumstances, hesitated. It let out a frustrated huff, pawing at the ground. But the wolf held its ground, a living wall of protective fury. After a tense, drawn-out standoff, the bear, clearly unwilling to engage in a potentially costly battle, turned and lumbered back into the shadows, its heavy footsteps slowly fading into the distance. The wolf watched until the last sound of the bear had vanished. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned back to Eleanor. Its breathing was still heavy, its muscles taut, but the immediate threat had passed. It lay back down, settling into its previous position, its vigilant eyes still scanning the forest, but now also returning to Eleanor, a silent testament to its protective act. It was an act that transcended the natural order, a profound intervention that solidified the unspoken alliance. Eleanor, in her haze of pain and exhaustion, registered the wolf not as a wild beast, but a fierce guardian, a silent protector in her most vulnerable moment, a creature that had chosen to stand between her and death. A wave of something akin to gratitude, deep and overwhelming, washed over her, even as the next contraction seized her, demanding her full attention. The forest, having witnessed the drama, settled back into its watchful silence, awaiting the dawn. As the first tendrils of dawn, pale and hesitant, began to weave their way through the dense canopy of ancient firs, painting the forest floor in shades of silver and gray, a new sound pierced the air. It was a tiny, fragile cry, a sound so utterly vulnerable, so profoundly new, that it seemed to momentarily silence the very forest itself. Eleanor, utterly spent, her body a battlefield of exhaustion and pain, felt an overwhelming surge of maternal love, pure and fierce, unlike anything she had ever known. She held her newborn son, a tiny, perfect being, warm and squalling against her chest. His skin was impossibly soft, his tiny fingers curled around her own, a desperate, anchoring grip. He was here, he was real, a miracle born of desperation and the raw, untamed heart of the wilderness.
The wolf, sensing the profound shift in the energy of the clearing, the cessation of the agonizing cries, and the emergence of this new tiny life, approached cautiously. Its movements were slow, deliberate, its head held low, sniffing the air, processing the unfamiliar sense of fresh blood and new life. Eleanor, cradling Leo, watched it, a new kind of fear mingling with a deep, almost primal trust. The wolf paused, its amber eyes fixing on the infant, then on Eleanor's face. Slowly, it extended its muzzle, nudging Eleanor's hand with its wet nose, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even acceptance. It was a moment of profound, wordless communication, a bridge between two worlds. Then, as if its task was complete, it settled back into its watchful position a short distance away, its vigilant eyes still scanning the forest perimeter, a silent, unwavering guardian.
A life had been born in the wild, under the silent watch of a creature society deemed savage, yet which had offered a profound, inexplicable form of aid, a testament to the unpredictable nature of instinct and compassion. In the days that followed, a strange, almost sacred symbiosis settled over Eleanor's makeshift camp. The wolf, which Eleanor had begun to mentally refer to as Lupa after the Roman myth, continued its guardianship with an unwavering devotion. It would often disappear for hours, only to return with freshly killed game, a plump rabbit, a young deer, sometimes even a brace of birds, leaving its silent offering near Eleanor's camp. These were not gifts, not acts of charity in the human sense, but rather a continuation of the primal pact forged in the crucible of birth. The meat, though raw and difficult to prepare with her limited resources, was sustenance, allowing Eleanor to slowly regain strength and, crucially, to nourish her child. She would tear at the flesh with her teeth, a desperate, almost animalistic act, knowing that every bite was for Leo, for their survival. Lupa would often lie just beyond the edge of the clearing, her presence a constant, reassuring anchor. Eleanor, still weak and recovering, found herself talking to the wolf, whispering her fears, her hopes, her gratitude. "Thank you, Lupa," she would murmur, holding Leo close. "Thank you for watching over us." The wolf would merely blink its intelligent eyes, sometimes letting out a soft huff, a sound that Eleanor began to interpret as acknowledgement. This strange, wild protector became her only companion, her only confidant in the vast, indifferent wilderness. She learned to read Lupa's subtle cues, the twitch of an ear, the shift in its posture, the direction of its gaze, all communicating the unseen movements and sounds of the forest. The bond, forged in desperation, deepened into something profound and inexplicable, a testament to the shared instinct for survival and the unexpected capacity for connection across species. But the wilderness, for all its unexpected kindness, was no place for an infant. As Leo grew stronger, his cries more robust, his tiny body demanding more than the rudimentary care Eleanor could provide, the urgency of returning to civilization became paramount. She needed warmth, proper food, medical attention for herself and her son. The thought of leaving Lupa, her silent savior, filled her with a pang of unexpected sorrow, a deep, aching sense of loss. But Leo's future was her priority. With renewed determination, drawing on the strength the wolf had helped her reclaim, Eleanor began her arduous journey back towards civilization. Lupa, as if understanding the unspoken decision, followed for a day or two, maintaining its customary distance. Then, as Eleanor neared the fringes of human habitation, the wolf eventually receded into the shadows, a loyal, wild protector of her secret, melting back into the ancient heart of the Black Forest, leaving Eleanor and Leo to face the human world, forever marked by their extraordinary ordeal. Weeks later, a disheveled Eleanor, her once elegant clothes now mere rags, her hair a tangled mess, clutching her infant son, stumbled into a small Bavarian village nestled at the foot of the mountains. Her gaunt face and haunted eyes told a story of hardship, but the healthy, robust infant in her arms was a testament to a miracle. Her story, whispered at first, then spreading like wildfire through the close-knit community, captured the imagination and skepticism of the locals in equal measure. A woman, alone, giving birth in the depths of the Black Forest? aided by a wolf? It was the stuff of ancient folklore, a tale spun by grandmothers around crackling fires. While some, particularly the older women like Frau Greta Schmidt, who possessed a deep respect for the ancient ways and the mysteries of nature, hailed her as a survivor, a woman touched by the wild. Others whispered about madness or fabrication. The men in the local taverns scoffed, dismissing it as a fever dream, the ramblings of a traumatized woman. A wolf, you say, protecting her? Nonsense. Wolves are killers, beasts of the wild, they'd argue, their voices thick with skepticism and a fear born of ignorance. The focus was entirely on the incredible, almost unbelievable tale of the wolf, its role in the birth, the raw, sensational aspect of her survival. But few, if any, dared to ask the more pertinent, more uncomfortable question. Why was she in the forest alone, pregnant, and so desperately trying to vanish from her former life? The villagers, in their provincial curiosity, were content to marvel at the surface story, unwilling to delve into the deeper, darker currents that had driven Eleanor into the wilderness. The miracle of birth in the wild overshadowed the mystery of her flight for a time. As Eleanor and her son Leo slowly began to heal in the care of the kind-hearted Frau Schmidt, who offered them shelter and sustenance in her modest cottage, fragments of Eleanor's past inevitably began to surface. The world, it seemed, was not so easily escaped. Her family, prominent figures in Munich's financial elite, eventually located her through discreet inquiries and the subtle tracking of her disappearance. Their arrival in the quiet Bavarian village was an event in itself. A sleek black limousine pulling up to Frau Schmidt's humble abode, a stark contrast to the rustic surroundings. Arthur Vance, Eleanor's father, a man whose presence commanded immediate attention, stepped out, his face a mask of strained relief that quickly contorted into thinly veiled contempt and fear as he took in Eleanor's disheveled appearance and the infant in her arms. Their initial relief at finding her alive quickly soured. They were less concerned with her harrowing survival, with the trauma she had endured, and far more with the scandal she represented. "Eleanor, what have you done?" her mother, Evelyn, whispered, her voice laced with a mixture of horror and disgust, her eyes darting nervously towards the curious villagers peeking from behind curtains. "Do you have any idea what this means for us, for the family name?" It became painfully clear that Eleanor's flight wasn't just about escaping a difficult, unsanctioned pregnancy. It was about escaping a much deeper, darker truth, one that her family desperately wanted to keep buried beneath layers of wealth, influence, and carefully constructed lies. They saw her not as a daughter who had suffered, but as a dangerous liability, a living embodiment of their worst nightmares. The wolf, the forest, the miraculous birth, these were mere distractions, inconvenient footnotes to the far more significant threat she posed to their meticulously maintained empire. The tension in Frau Schmidt's small, cozy living room was thick, almost suffocating, as Eleanor faced her family. Arthur Vance, his face a thundercloud of barely suppressed rage, stood before her, flanked by his stern-faced lawyers and his equally cold brother, Eleanor's uncle, Robert. Evelyn, her mother, wrung her hands, her eyes avoiding Eleanor's direct gaze. The shocking truth, the real reason for Eleanor's desperate flight, emerged during this tense confrontation, not in a tearful confession, but in Eleanor's calm, resolute defiance. She had not simply run away in shame. She had exposed a massive, intricate financial fraud orchestrated by her father and uncle. It involved illicit dealings, shell corporations, and the ruthless exploitation of vulnerable communities across Europe, all designed to line their already overflowing pockets. Eleanor, with her sharp intellect and privileged access, had stumbled upon the incriminatory evidence. She had gathered it meticulously, intending to go out to the authorities, driven by a profound sense of justice that her family's wealth had never managed to corrupt.
But her family, upon discovering her intent and, crucially, her pregnancy, the child's father being Julian Thorne, a principled whistleblower she had fallen in love with, and whose own efforts to expose the Vances had made him a target, had attempted to silence her. They had threatened her, subtly at first, then with escalating intensity, culminating in thinly veiled threats against her and her unborn child. They had made it clear that if she spoke, not only would her reputation be destroyed, but Julian would disappear, and her child would be taken from her, branded illegitimate, a stain on their pristine lineage. Her flight into the Black Forest was not just an escape from shame or the consequences of an inconvenient pregnancy. It was a desperate, courageous act to protect her child and, in time, to bring a powerful, corrupt family to justice. The secret wasn't just the wild birth, the miraculous survival with the Wolf's aid. It was the moral fortitude to stand against her own blood for what was right, and the undeniable, damning evidence she still carried, hidden away, to expose them. The revelation of Eleanor's true courage and her family's deep-seated corruption sent shockwaves through society, reverberating far beyond the quiet Bavarian village. The media, initially captivated by the sensational Wolf Mother story, quickly shifted its focus to the far more explosive tale of corporate fraud and familial betrayal. Eleanor, once dismissed as a distraught, perhaps delusional woman, became a symbol of integrity, a modern-day heroine who had risked everything to uphold justice.
Her meticulously gathered evidence, a digital cache he had cleverly secured and sent to a trusted, anonymous contact before her flight, combined with her compelling testimony, led to a major investigation. Arrests followed swiftly, dismantling a powerful, seemingly untouchable financial network that had preyed on the innocent for decades. Arthur and Robert Vance, stripped of their power and prestige, faced the full force of the law, their empire crumbling around them. Eleanor, once a societal outcast, vilified and abandoned by her own blood, found herself unexpectedly lauded. Her story of the wolf, once dismissed as a fable born of delirium, became a poignant testament to the unexpected sources of protection and strength in a world where human trust had failed so spectacularly. It spoke to the primal wisdom of nature, the ancient bonds that sometimes transcend species. She and Leo, forever marked by the wilderness, found a new life, not of opulence, but of genuine freedom and peace. Eleanor, with the support of Julian, who had been in hiding and was now safe, began to rebuild, advocating for victims of financial fraud and using her experience to highlight the importance of ethical conduct. Her journey, a testament to the wild spirit that had protected them and the unwavering truth that, sometimes, the purest help comes from the most unexpected places, resonated deeply. The echoes of the forest, where she had found both fear and salvation, continued to guide her, a constant reminder of the raw, untamed justice that sometimes prevails when all else fails.